California Local Energy and Climate colleagues. I'm Angie Hacker, the Statewide Best Practices Coordinator with the California Climate and Energy Collaborative. This role is overseen by the Local Government Commission with ratepayer funding from the state's regional energy networks. And our goal is to advance and exchange knowledge amongst local governments pursuing local and state energy and climate goals. And one way I can do that is by talking directly with professionals in the state that can share firsthand on the ground experiences and local best practices. So today I'm very excited to talk with Shayna Hirshfield-Gold, the climate coordinator with the City of Oakland, which is doing groundbreaking work to advance equity as part of their climate action efforts. So welcome, Shayna.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And to start from the very top, could you take a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners who are primarily folks like you working in local governments trying to do energy and climate work, and tell us a little bit about your role in Oakland's Equitable Climate Action programs.
Absolutely. So yes, I've been with the City of Oakland for 7 years. Before that, I spent another 7 years, I think, working in energy efficiency. And I actually have a background in community organizing and social work before that. So a little bit of a varied path. With Oakland and with the ECAP in particular, I was the project manager as we created the ECAP. That was about a 3-year process. This was not the first climate action plan in Oakland, of course. We had our energy and climate action plan that the city and a number of partners created back from 2009 to 2012. This was not renewing that plan. This was creating an entirely new plan, very data-driven, very community-driven, very equity-driven. And so I had the pleasure of overseeing that process, but again, with a lot of different partners.
Well, that sounds familiar. I also was involved in an ECAP at a local government at one point, but yeah, the E in ECAP is changing. So let's dive into that a little bit more too. But my first real question is, in my role, I meet a lot of local governments who are genuinely interested in doing a better job involving environmental justice voices and creating opportunities for historically underserved or marginalized communities. And they would like to be part of a word that they just learned called just transition. And so it's a big shift on top of work that is already complicated. And so many practitioners that I come across are sounding very unequipped and would like to do it right, but aren't sure how. And so for governments that would like to get started, can you just tell us kind of the step-by-step story of how Oakland began weaving equity into its climate work?
In terms of step-by-step, again, this definitely came before me. The first process when Oakland created its energy and climate action plan, that was kind of in the first round when cities were first starting to think about climate action plans. And, what does this mean? How do we do it? How do we measure? How do we, track towards our KPIs and everything? Again, that happened before I came in, but what was interesting about that process is that the city had been intending to create this energy and climate action plan. And at the same time, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in Oakland received outside funding. I think it was through their Green Jobs Not Jails campaign. I'm pretty sure I'm getting that title right. And their intention was to kind of lobby the city really to create a climate action plan of and for and by the people. And so you kind of had this groundswell, sort of within the city organization and within the community to say, we need to do this right, and we need to do this together. And my predecessor, the wonderful Garrett Fitzgerald, really worked with these community organizations hand in hand to create the first plan. And that kind of set a precedent for collaborative planning and for deep listening. I think one of the things that really needed to be improved on in that plan was taking a much more kind of realistic and almost cutthroat approach to what is measurable and achievable and within a real sphere of control. And that was what we tried to make sure we got right in this plan within, or, you know, under the umbrella of changing that E again, from energy and to equitable. Everything within this climate action plan, the Equitable Climate Action Plan, was really about addressing equity head on, and addressing, like you mentioned the term just transition, and really looking at the climate crisis is just that. It is a crisis. It is an emergency. It needs to be treated as that. And to do that, you can't just use technical solutions. You have to have solutions that absolutely start with the people and with frontline communities in particular, because there are communities that are being hit first and worst by the climate crisis. Those are the same communities who have the most to lose if we mess up. And they're the communities that have the most to gain if we do this right. And they're often also the ones who, you know, have perspectives that we can't get by doing a data only approach. So, you know, taking that, you know, frontline community centric approach to this work, and then also being very clear-eyed about what is in our sphere of control, what is measurable and verifiable and trackable. Those, I would say, were kind of the two guideposts to this work. And, you know, it was a 3-year process, because again, we were kind of making sure that we were staying in those lanes. And it wasn't always easy, because you're communicating, you know, across a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different perspectives to say, we've got to maintain an eye on the data. We've got to maintain an eye on what's in our regulatory and legal sphere of control. We've got to maintain people and frontline communities in particular at the center of this work. So, you know, it was a lot of communication and translation.
And this is why I wanted to talk to you, because 3 years ago, this was not the language everybody was beginning to use. So you guys were really ahead of the game in a way. And I'm wondering, was there an event 3 years ago that really prompted this dramatic shift, which I feel like if you're an insider in local government, you would understand that abandoning your old climate action plan structures would be a very big overhaul and have a lot of work associated with it. So what precipitated such a big shift?
Again, you know, to me, I don't think of this as a shift at all. To me, this really was a logical growth out of that first foray with Oakland's first ECAP. You know, that grew out of that process I was mentioning, where, you know, the city was working on developing a climate action plan, and the community came together and said, this has to work for the people. This has to be of the people, by the people. And, you know, a lot of groups came together and really organized themselves to say, we need a coordinated voice here, you know, working with the city. And a lot of communication channels were established at that time. But I think that was one of many processes that have happened in Oakland over the years that have really shown a spotlight on our not at all unique history of disinvestment and, you know, systemic racism, call it what it is, right? That have so disproportionately impacted certain communities. And so you had this, you know, growing awareness, I think, in the city organization of disproportionately impacted communities. A very clear recognition that those communities are wonderfully, you know, getting a stronger and stronger voice. You know, Oakland is a very strident community. It's a very, very activist community. I think that's a blessing. It's a challenge and it's a blessing. And so, you know, this was something that people couldn't ignore. But at the same time, you know, we were getting more and more tools, stumbling along the way, but, you know, more and more tools in terms of allies. And like I said, just communication channels. And then in 2018, our city council adopted a climate emergency and just transition resolution. We actually had already started working on the baseline data that was going to go into this ECAP. And for that was the CURB report. A lot of people who are members of SEEK will have maybe heard of Oakland's CURB report. That was something that we did in collaboration with Bloomberg and a number of other partners. The CURB software was developed by the World Bank and Bloomberg and some others. And we used the software. We were the first city in North America to use the software. Basically looks at what are the biggest bang for the buck, cost-effective and impactful actions that the city can take to get to deep emissions reduction. And out of that tool also came, what is the maximum feasible reduction target that we can hit in 2030, 40, and 50? So we kind of brought those together as our baseline data, but we also were very, again, clear-eyed about the fact that this was one small set of tools that it actually gave us. The model spit out after a long time and lots of analysis and lots of work, 5 top strategies that we needed to adopt in order to hit our targets. But we really saw that as one small piece of what was eventually going to go into this plan, because we wanted that to be something that we could, really give to the community and say, okay, this is not addressing equity. This is not addressing consumption emissions. This is not addressing the economic transition. There's a lot that these top 5 are not addressing. What these are addressing is how do we rapidly reduce our local emissions? And we can do that in many, many ways. So let's work together to figure out what are the equitable ways that we do that, what else do we need to do, and what do we need to do to address adaptation and consumption emissions.
So CURB, does it do your inventory and your projections? No, just projecting emission reduction.
CURB was a one-time analysis.
Okay.
That it helped us to understand that we could get to 60% emissions reduction by 2030. And it gave us, it looked at things like, what percentage of buildings in Oakland have wall insulation and have ceiling insulation, and at what rate are we renovating buildings, and getting into really nitty gritty, how rapidly is mode shift happening, all of these things. And so, it's a deep decarbonization potential analysis.
Right. So it sounds like that's really interesting, because I wasn't sure what led with what. So it sounds like your criteria was still based on emission reduction calculations to come up with strategies, rather than overlaying additional criteria on top of that to shift the decisions around what strategies to focus on. Does that sound about right? So instead, we're figuring out how to equitably implement those top 5.
It's so interesting because it's such an intersectional plan. So I kind of break it down in categories of deep decarbonization locally, right? Because Oakland has done, we call it local and life cycle, but the technical terms are core and consumption emissions inventories, right? We do core and consumption inventories every single time. We do them in parallel every 2 years, right? And so the ECAP was intended to get to deep decarbonization in terms of our local emissions. How far could we go in terms of our global impact, or life cycle consumption? All these different terms interchangeably. How do we get at adaptation? And how do we do all of this, again, within that deep equity lens? So the CURB report was intended only to get at that one wedge of local emissions, local deep decarbonization. And that's because when our city council adopts our emissions reduction targets, they only adopt those targets for local emissions. Consumption emissions are still, that science is still evolving. way too rapidly, and there are too many assumptions. There's too much proxy data that we have to bring in. So while we are very committed to doing those inventories because they give us a very good broad brushstroke to what we're responsible for globally and what broad categories we need to focus on, we don't feel that there's enough integrity in the data to adopt numerical targets. So our numerical targets are for local emissions, and this is back to what I was saying before about having, science-based targets and being very clear about our sphere of control. So we wanted to have that data so that we could say, this is what the data say. This is what we need to do in order to have the greatest impact. Because again, council adopted, it's a climate emergency and just transition resolution. So the climate crisis, it's an emergency. We have to address it with, the greatest ammunition that we have. Right. So it's kind of like hitting from a lot of different sides at once.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great conversation because I think other communities are trying to figure out how to weigh these things, how to meaningfully integrate them together. How do you actually come up with a plan that involves all of these things? I wonder if we can get down even further into the nitty gritty, because so many local governments are trying to figure out how are other local governments doing their inventory? So like, what systems were you using for that? How does that flow through to implementation? And how did you pay for all of this? Was there, because you had a special focus on equity, were you able to access additional types of funding, or was this all just funded in-house?
Boy, wouldn't that have been nice? Yeah, no, we did not have additional funding. And my hope is actually that because of this initial foray that we took into being so strident about including equity, incorporating equity into our climate strategy, I'm hoping that that's going to help us, argue for more funding in the future. But this might be jumping ahead a little bit. I would say that we did not have enough funding to adequately support the public engagement process. We had a pretty robust public engagement process, but I think it could have been a lot stronger and would have benefited from being a lot stronger if we'd had a lot more funding. Unfortunately, I think, government agencies are still kind of catching up to the fact that this needs to be funded. A lot of them have gotten the fact that it needs to be done, right? But it needs to be done and it needs to be funded. And they're still kind of getting there. And now we have COVID, which makes it more challenging. In terms of your first question about our inventories, we use ClearPath for our local emissions. Our consumption emissions, that is an Excel-based tool that we have built in-house, and we use a lot of different data sources for it. In fact, many others. We use some pieces of the Cool California. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one developed by Chris Jones. We use different pieces of different data, and we have revised it every time that we, every 2 years that when we've gone in and done the inventory, there has been new data, there have been new best practices. David Alloway up in Oregon is one of the giants in this field. We learn a lot from him. And I would say that, the cities that have been doing these consumption-based inventories, we're all talking to each other. We're all learning from each other. So every time we do it, we get better and better and better. And we're able to go back and, slightly revise the past inventories to make sure that the data is all consistent over the years. There have never been any massive changes that have said, oh my God, we thought that this was the biggest category and it turns out it's that. That has never been the case. It's just been kind of refining, but they're impactful refinements.
So I wanted to point some of our listeners to some key things that I saw in your climate action plan, your equity and climate action plan, that I think make it unique and different from what a normal city's climate action plan might do. And so there's language in there that you wouldn't normally see, like the letter from the mayor in the beginning says it's the introduction. The Equitable Climate Action Plan is our strategy to create a future built on justice, equal opportunity, and environmental protection. You don't see that normally. There's a leading with equity section. There's a whole section on equitable implementation, which focuses on who benefits and targeting frontline communities. there's reference, which I'm hoping you might be able to dive into a little bit, to the Racial Equity Impact Assessment and Implementation Guide, RIA. And then there's also a lot of language around equitable governance, nods to tribal ancestral lands, diversity, low-income residents, historically underserved and disproportionately burdened community. I mean, there's all the right language, and I feel like you must have had a lot of good engagement. And I am hoping you would touch a little bit in on that racial equity impact assessment. Just tell us a little bit more about what that is.
Yeah, so that's, we call it the raya for short. It's a long name. It was adopted in conjunction with the ECAP, and it's exactly what the title says. So this is looking at how do we make sure that we are implementing this thing equitably and that the benefits will flow to frontline communities first as intended. Because of course, it's a 10-year plan with 40 actions. We can't get into detailed implementation plans on each of those 40 actions. And so the RAIA is meant to be kind of a guide as we go. So the RAIA says things like, how do you figure out who are the frontline communities for each action? Because they change. You know, it's not enough just to say BIPOC communities and we're done with it, or low-income communities and we're done with it, because depending on what you're looking at, your frontline communities are going to be very, very different. For example, when you're talking about vehicle electrification, truckers who tend to be, I mean, not across the board, but they tend to be a little bit whiter, are absolutely a frontline community. They are in those trucks, breathing the fumes, not making a ton of money. How are they going to pay for, you know, these new vehicles, this new equipment? How are they going to charge? You know, that is very much a frontline community, as are low-income and BIPOC and refugee communities who live alongside the freeways where all these trucks are going, right? So you know, the who is a frontline community changes from action to action, and you need to be able and willing to do that analysis of who are the frontline communities for each action as you go, and revise it over time, because these things are not static. So the RAIA talks about that. You mentioned equitable governance, making sure that there is not just one-time engagement when the plan is first being created, but engagement over time as we're implementing it, so that the community continues to have a voice at the table, so you have that continuous feedback loop, so that people feel that they're really being heard and validated and empowered and benefited by the ongoing implementation.
Can you tell us a little bit what that actually looks like? Is that an operation already?
One of the actions in the ECAP is to create an Oakland Climate Action Network, and we're still in process of fundraising for that.
Got it.
But yeah, the idea there is that we need to do a much better job of community empowerment for really power shifting and power sharing around implementation, and it's not good enough to just say, oh, we have a committee or a commission or a board,
yep,
and be done with it. We know that, and this is through conversations with our Department of Race and Equity and with others, that we've been doing boards and commissions for decades now, and they have not really led to the profound shifts in equity and justice that we need to see. We need a different approach. You can't expect a dozen members of the public who don't have the kind of technical background that we do, who are not being compensated, who are showing up maybe once a month, to be able to actually participate on an equal footing in terms of, you know, data analysis and, you know, selecting among different policy options and understanding the legal ramifications.
Yeah.
Let alone, you can't assume that those dozen or so members speak for all of the community, or even speak for all of the frontline communities in your city. And there's no way to assure that having a body like that in place will actually change the dynamics in terms of who's getting contracts from the city? Are those contracts flowing out of the city? Are the contracts staying in the city, but with the people who always win contracts? Or are contracts actually going to historically underrepresented and historically marginalized communities? Are grassroots organizations able to engage in equal dialogue and equitable dialogue with the city, with people who are in our chairs and making decisions for their communities? Do they really have a seat at the table? Are we really listening to them? Do we even know who to call? Do we know how to understand when they come at us with righteous anger? Do we understand how to really listen to what are the concerns that they're bringing to us? So the idea behind the Oakland Climate Action Network is more about capacity building. It's about grassroots organizational capacity building. So do these orgs have that, background knowledge and professional capacity to engage in that dialogue, to actually sit at the table and provide meaningful input so that we actually can co-develop things together? So
Yeah,
that's what that's about.
Time to do it, right? Not just the skills, but oftentimes the environmental justice groups are under-resourced as much as the communities they represent, and are doing 50 different things in a strapped budget. So they don't have time to go noodle in on all of our policies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel you. I've done some work with frontline communities, and I have found that sometimes it's best to go to them in the places they feel comfortable and bring the information to the places they're already engaged and have access and capacity to spend their time. I'm curious though, for you personally, what have you learned? You've been at this work a while. What new language and skills did you have to acquire to do this work well?
I think that patience is a huge part of it. I will freely admit that I am not the most patient person out there. And I'm fortunate that I do have a background in both policy analysis and community work. But even so, it's hard that, the data might be screaming, we have to do X, Y, and Z. Like, I mentioned the CURB report. It's very, very clear. These 5 things, we've got to do them, and then beyond local emissions, we need to address our consumption. We need to start looking at, repair and reuse and building those skills back into our, local culture and our local economies. So, we can know these things from the data, but when you go out to communities, people start talking about very, very different things. And so it's really, it goes back really to classic tenets that, that were all around me when I was in school to get my master's in social work. You can't just go into a community and say, hi, I know a lot of stuff, I'm here to help.
Yeah. Here's my linear framework. Work with it. Yeah.
Yeah. You just can't do that. And, alongside that, looking at, okay, oh my God, we have to address this as an emergency. We need, to have the most impactful things. In our community engagement, one of the actions that was voted, was voted most highly by people who came to our community engagement meetings, was creation of a public bank. It's not feasible in the short term. It's, according to our finance director, because that's who I need to ask about things like this, because I'm not implementing public bank. According to our finance director, it's not even feasible at a single city scale. And there's no guarantee that it would, result in deep, let alone immediate emissions reductions. And yet that was what people felt was, of utmost importance to include in the climate action plan. And so we had to include it. It's in there. It's one of the 40 actions. And, just kind of the patience to say, okay, we're going to take that. And, this doesn't get to be my plan. Right? There are 425,000 people in Oakland. so being able to kind of hold all of those things and the patience to say, okay, we're not going to be able to run as fast as I want to run, but we've got to be able to get there together. And, we still got, the most impactful things in there. And, the way that we did this brought the maximum number of people along. And that ultimately is what is most important, because we're never going to get there without the entire community on board. And so that is what's the most important. But, just kind of having the patience and the deep breathing to, to hold all of that, I think for me was one of the biggest lessons.
Yeah, I think you're not alone. People that were trained up to be climate practitioners have now been either self-assigned or directed to be just designers of the future in general, which is a big ask, and it's a lot to think about. It gets away, it can be so large, it gets away from maybe the experience and background and professional skills that you have. So thank you for sharing that. I think that will resonate with a lot of people. And I just figured maybe we spend a little time just kind of noodling into the pitfalls, for folks that are trying to do this work. What's some of the major pitfalls you may have experienced early on in this work and in the development of this plan that if folks starting this work now could benefit from hearing about? And then we'll talk too about some of the successes. These investments you're making must be paying off, and we want to hear about that too.
Pitfalls. Okay. I would say, I'll point to two things, one of which is external and one of which is personal. So the external one I think is pretty obvious to everybody. And I would just say it's, we're recovering from a history of deep and legitimate mistrust. So, it's related to what I was saying a moment ago of, going into a room full of people from frontline communities as a government person is, that's a challenging position to be in, no matter what your intentions are. And so a lot of time, you go in, you want to talk about this plan, but we need to first talk about why people are so angry about the permitting system for tree removal, or whatever it is, the specific plans, this, that, or the other. You have to spend time kind of leaning into these places of real discomfort, because there is a huge history of mistrust, and it is very, very well founded. So we're building back trust, and that's part of the work, but it's a big obstacle. And then I think for me, and again, this is related also to what we were just saying. I tend to too often feel like the data speak for themselves. And so, kind of going in and saying like, okay, here's the pie chart of, our local emissions, and here's the pie chart of our life cycle emissions. And, this shows why we need to focus on consumption. And, if you break down this shows why we need to focus on transportation. And, I'll have a whole room full of people say, okay, but we want to talk about urban farming. And it's like, okay, I want to talk about urban farming too, but I would love to talk about this stuff first. So, it goes back to patience, and it goes back to listening. I think it's all of a piece.
So have the events of the last year, including COVID, changed this work for you, impacted how you can engage, or any other major shifts in the last year, just having gone through a difficult time?
I think, obviously it's changed how we can engage. And it has, really spotlighted the need for, clear and consistent communication. I feel like there's been a lot of compassion, actually, from, most corners of communities, because everybody's having a hard time. And so I feel like a lot of people do have more patience, but at the same time, they have less bandwidth. So in terms of this last year, we've definitely been having to, really focus on, a few things. And, it's less bandwidth in terms of, the impacts of COVID and, people are working from home or people are out of work, things like this, but also, emotional bandwidth in terms of, the deep racial reckoning in our country that's been going on for the last year. And, really, I think we're all just called on to speak directly to that and to highlight even more, these intersections of, of the work that we're doing. And also to acknowledge that, even if we've been speaking about our climate work with, a social and racial justice lens for years, but that is also not sufficient, for doing the deeper work. And so sometimes it is just, okay, we've got to stop everything, and because the community needs to talk about policing right now, or that's kind of the most obvious example. But so okay, I'm gonna do kind of back channel work until we can get back there again.
Yeah. Well, so looking forward now, just I'm curious if you can tell us, what have you seen? So this was adopted, you started it 3 years ago, it was adopted in 2020. So you're probably still just in the midst of beginning to implement. But can you tell us some highlights of how your programs have sort of feasibly changed? Any highlights and successes where you can see, yeah, doing it this way mattered, and we're on our way?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll point to, maybe two different things. One is that we did pass, we got the ECAP adopted in July of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. And then we adopted a new ordinance requiring all new construction to be all electric in December of 2020. So those are two huge climate wins in the midst of the pandemic. And so flowing from that, in terms of buildings, the next thing, now that we've addressed new construction, the ECAP says that all existing buildings in Oakland need to be all electric by 2040. And by the end of 2022, we need to have the plan in place for how we're going to do that. So incredibly ambitious, even more so now that, this pandemic is setting us back a bit. But getting to kind of focus on that right now is, I think, I'm not going to say exactly that it's the privilege, but it's nice to be able to focus in on, this specific area. It's also not the only thing I'm doing right now, but, being able to really focus on electrifying existing buildings and all that comes from that. How do we make sure that there is not going to be an increase in housing displacement as a result? How do we make sure that this is going to lead to high road jobs and local economic development? How do we make sure that this isn't going to, negatively affect frontline communities, and that people suffering the worst impacts of poor air quality are going to benefit first and foremost, right, from indoor air quality improvements from electrification? And how are we going to ensure energy security? All these questions that we all know we're asking with this. Being able to really sit down and wrestle with that piece is fun. And then, I mean that truly, it's a lot of work, but it's fun. And then the other thing that we're working on is our 50-year urban forest master plan. And so that's, very much on the other side, but our ECAP, takes a big look at carbon sequestration. There's a whole section on carbon removal in there. And so looking at, again, there are intersections here with housing displacement and community well-being and air quality and all of this. And there's a huge public engagement component to the urban forest master plan. So, I'm not one of the ones working on the data component of that plan, but I am advising the community engagement And that's also a lot of fun because it's being able to go back out to the community and say, okay, thank you for participating in creating the ECAP. We're making good on it. You know, we're following through, we're working on the priorities that came up in that plan. And for me, it's been really gratifying because having been the project manager for the ECAP, now my colleagues across the city are coming to me and kind of doing what you're doing. You're saying, you know, okay, how did you do that community engagement? And where do you wish you would have done better? Because it certainly wasn't perfect. And so I'm getting to kind of help co-create a lot of these engagement processes that are in some way related to or directly flowing from the ECAP. And so it really does feel like a wonderful continuity from that process.
Can you give us just like one or two of those tips? What do you tell them? What have you done in the engagement world? I feel like I ask this question all the time because everybody wants to know how to engage better, whether it's climate action or clean energy or whatever it is. What have you done that you found really worked? You had meaningful engagement, you left a meeting and you said yes, or you made a new relationship or collaboration and oof, yes.
Yeah. Well, I would say a few. One is just, you know, we hired an equity facilitator team in addition to our, you know, more science-based consultant. And the equity facilitator team was comprised of folks from the Oakland community. That's really, I think it's important anywhere. The Oakland community is particularly vocal about, we don't want consultants from the outside coming in and telling us what to do or telling you how to best serve the community. The community wants to tell the local government how to best serve, which makes sense. So, you know, I would say, you know, one, hiring from within the community, hiring trusted people, trusted neutral people from the community. I would say, you know, that's really important. If you can do stipends, really, really important. We were able to our equity facilitator team hired a neighborhood leadership cohort, they called it, 2 community members from each council district, and they trained them on how government works, the basics of climate science, how to do, you know, and basics of community engagement. And then they provided stipends. So the city wasn't paying them directly because that would have been a fiscal nightmare. But the community members did get stipends. It started at $15 an hour, and I think our equity facilitator team actually did their own fundraising, got an extra grant, and were able to, up those stipends to $20 an hour.
That's amazing.
But there's one more thing that I want to say here, which I think is really, really important. And this is that a lot of my colleagues, I have so many wonderful colleagues, but I've noticed that there are a number of people who, despite the best of intentions, when I come to them and I say, what I'm hearing X, Y, and Z from the community, people really want to do this or that. And my colleagues will say, well, they just need to understand that that's not possible. And you know, maybe not verbatim, but sometimes. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and I'll say, well, did you ever sit down with a community group and explain that that's not possible or why it's not possible? Well, no, but they just need to understand, or they can look at the website. And it takes a lot of time, and it does take some very specific skills to sit down with community members and be vulnerable and be humble and say, we can't do this because of some obscure regulation, or because this one time people screwed up and it ended up costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars, and so we just can't now. But it's so important to provide those explanations, because otherwise on the other side, people are just, you know, they're just seeing a hand. They're just hearing no.
Oh, government can't do this, right? Yeah. Government doesn't really want to help me. Yeah.
Right, and that's exactly right. Is what they hear is there's no interest in helping me, because you would never say to a peer, you know, to a friend, just no. You would say no because you would take the time. It's basic decency. It's basic respect. But again, you know, our institutions need to reflect the fact that that takes time, and that sometimes that takes very, very specific skills, and sometimes it takes a lot of conflict resolution. So, you know, I did spend a lot of time in community meetings for the ECAP, sitting down with people and explaining why you can't plant fruit trees in street medians, because nobody had ever said why. And people were saying there are food insecure people. You've got this huge median there. Why can't I just plant a fruit tree? Well, you know, to a lot of us, that's obvious, but to somebody else, it's not. And we need to take that time.
Oh, you could probably teach a whole long semester-long course on this and your experiences. I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this. And, you know, from my vantage point, I do feel hopeful about the future, just from what I'm hearing from, at least at the state level, wanting to do more to support local governments in doing this work and trying to figure out how, and perhaps seeing a shift in the amount of resources that are headed our way for this kind of work. So I feel like a lot of folks are going to be looking up to you all and what you're doing in Oakland, and tracking you to see what other good ideas you have. So again, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to share with local governments before we sign off?
I mean, just keep doing the work and keep fighting for the resources.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for sharing your work, experience, and advice, and thanks to our listeners. We do hope this conversation has provided food for thought about ways to weave equity into your community's clean energy and climate action work. And from, you know, the governor's California Comeback Plan and the White House's American Jobs Act, there is an enormous amount of interest in building a future that is both climate safe and equitable. And funds are beginning to follow for those that demonstrate a commitment to this work. So now is the time to begin building those partnerships and relationships. We'll leave you with an invitation to consider these questions in your own community. Who benefits from the opportunities you're creating? Whose voice shapes your decisions? Who is protected when disaster strikes? And I think I'll just close by saying we all know that this work was already complex, and that this additional work is going to require some more patience. Like Shayna says, it is long overdue, and we wish you luck out there as you begin or continue to do this important work. To access capacity building and other knowledge building resources or make technical assistance requests, please visit us at eecoordinator.info. And until next time, stay well.